Colorado Territory, early winter, December 1883. Snow had fallen in the night, layering the plains in a stillness that felt sacred. The air was brittle with cold, and a thin sun hovered like a ghost behind gauzy clouds. Sam Callahan rode the fence line at a slow trot, coat flapping like a weary flag, his breath coiling in silver plumes. His mare's hooves broke the silence with dull crunches, and the saddle leather creaked in protest with every shift of his weight. He didn't expect to see anything. This land rarely offered surprises worth hoping for. But just beyond the ridge, something disrupted the whitewash of snow. A wagon, half collapsed, leaned at a pitiful angle. One wheel had split clean through, the canvas torn and rimmed with frost like the skin of a wound. Sam narrowed his eyes and pulled his mare to a halt. The scene was too still. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into the cold crust. One hand hovered near the revolver on his hip as he stepped closer, every sense sharp with the kind of caution winter taught a man. Then the canvas stirred. A figure emerged, frail, hunched, clutching a bundled child to her chest. Her coat was ragged, hair wind-whipped, and her voice cracked from both weather and wear when she spoke. "Sir, we don't want trouble, but my children," she stopped to swallow, "they haven't eaten since yesterday. Do you have old corn, anything at all?" Her face was hollow with fatigue, cheeks raw from the wind, and her eyes red-rimmed and wide carried a kind of shame that still clung to dignity. Behind her, the blanket-covered shape of a child stirred. Another small face peeked out from the wagon's torn flap. 5 children. He would learn their names later. But right then, his eyes went to the girl in her arms, limp, breath shallow, lips tinted blue. He opened his mouth, ready to say no, to tell them to move along like all the others who'd come begging through this broken land. But then, faint and small, came a whimper barely audible except to the mother holding her. It was enough. Sam gave a single nod, turned on his heel without a word. "Come," he said over his shoulder. She hesitated only a heartbeat, then followed, trudging through the snow with the quiet desperation of someone who'd used up every prayer. He led them to the old supply shed behind the barn, the only space, besides his cabin with walls, a roof, and a stove that still burned. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and close, the dying coals in the stove little more than a memory. He knelt and stirred the embers, coaxing life back into them with kindling and breath. The woman laid her children onto a pile of hay. Her limbs moved stiffly, her fingers shaking with cold. She didn't cry, not yet. Sam rose, pulled a dented pot from a dusty shelf, and poured in the last of his cornmeal. He added water from the bucket and set it over the flame. Not a word passed between them. The youngest boy whimpered softly in a corner. Another clutched his sister's hand like an anchor. When the porridge was ready, Sam ladled it into tin cups and placed one before each child. Then he crouched beside the girl in her mother's arms and gently lifted the cup to her lips. She swallowed, just a sip, but it was enough. Her cheeks flushed slightly, color blooming like frost melting under dawn light. The mother watched him with trembling lips. "I don't even know your name," she whispered. He looked up, voice calm but firm. "Eat. Names can come later," she nodded, biting her bottom lip as her eyes filled. The fire cracked in the stove, casting golden shadows across the plank walls. For the first time that morning, the shed didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a breath, a pause between storms, a place not for endings, but something close to beginning. By the next morning, the wind had stilled and the sky held its breath. A faint silver light bathed the yard in silence. Eliza rose from her makeshift bed of blankets, careful not to wake the smallest child pressed against her side. She tucked them in, adjusted her worn shawl, and stepped out into the cold. Her cheeks burned from the frost, but her spine was straight. Without instruction, she moved toward the barn. Her footsteps crunched lightly as she filled a weathered bucket at the well and carried it, arms trembling, across the yard, inside the barn. She swept away soiled straw and shoveled frozen manure with calm determination. She laid down fresh hay, patted a horse's warm flank, and stood in the quiet breath of the animals. It smelled of dry grass, leather, and warmth. She closed her eyes. It reminded her of a kitchen long gone, and a time when home wasn't just a word whispered through. Cracked lips dot from the porch of his cabin. Sam watched. Tin cup in hand, steam curling from the rim. He stood still as the frost on the windows. He made no move to interrupt her. Later, Eliza entered the kitchen. The scent of iron and smoke lingered in the air. She didn't touch the blackened pot, still crusted from last night's meal. Instead, she filled a clean pot with water, set it to boil, and began rinsing the tin bowls one by one. She tore a strip from her shawl, dipped it into the warm water, and began scrubbing the stovetop and handles. A soft, nostalgic scent cinnamon and licorice rose from the cloth. Her mother's kitchen. By the time sunlight crested the ridge, Eliza stepped out onto the porch, hands chapped and red but steady. Sam turned. She stood before him, scarf lifting in the breeze, eyes lit with something clear and strong. "I wanted to thank you, sir," she said quietly, "for what you did last night. We'll be gone before noon. I'll fix the wheel as best I can." Sam didn't move. His jaw tensed. "That child nearly froze in your arms," he said, voice low. "You think a patched wheel and a bowl of cornmeal is enough to send you back out?" She flinched, fingers tightening around her shawl. "I didn't mean to impose. I thought, kindness like yours, it's rare. I didn't want to overstay it." His gaze flickered. He looked at her like a man deciding whether to open a long-locked door. "You want to repay kindness," he said. "Keep your children alive. You want to do it warm or wrapped in tarp." He turned toward the cabin, then paused. "Stay till spring if you need to. No one's throwing you out." Eliza stood frozen, breath catching. It wasn't charity, not pity. It was something weightier, something she'd nearly forgotten how to name. Shelter, respect, maybe even grace. That night, in the shed, she tucked her children into their hay beds. Ethan, the eldest, pulled off his boots and blinked in wonder. They had been mended, the leather stitched neatly, the holes patched with soft pieces from an old saddlebag. New laces. A quiet gift. Eliza knelt beside him and held his hand a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, folded a square of linen, and from her thread kit pulled a single strand of red. Beneath lantern light, she embroidered a letter, just one S. She laid it beside Sam's bowl of stew and slipped away. The next morning, laughter rang through the yard. The youngest children had built a snowman from straw, topped with a crooked hat. Sam watched through the window, his expression unreadable, but his hand lingered on the window frame, as if holding the warmth inside. Across the snow-covered yard, Eliza watched him too. This time, not with fear but with quiet knowing. Steam curled from her cup, and she didn't look away. The days unfolded in a rhythm of quiet labor. One morning, Eliza gathered her children near the back of the barn where dry earth had laid fallow for years. She rolled up her sleeves, handed Ethan a tin of crushed eggshells, the younger ones small pails of ash. Together they knelt in the dirt, folding it gently into the soil. *, "This is how we help the ground breathe again," she said softly. "If it still has breath, it can still grow something good." The wind pulled at her shawl, but her hands remained steady. Her children laughed real, unburdened laughter. Later that day, Eliza returned to the patch and stopped in surprise. The rows had been mounded higher, dark mulch freshly laid. Resting against a stone sat a cloth bag. Inside, seed packets, carefully tied with twine. She turned her gaze toward the cabin. Sam was splitting wood, eyes fixed on each swing. He never looked up, but he didn't need to. The gesture thundered in its silence. That evening, they shared a meal. Salt pork smoked over the fire. Eliza baked flatbread on a smooth stone, the children devouring each bite with wide-eyed reverence. She handed Sam a plate. He accepted it, without a word, but nodded once, a gesture that held more than language. As she cleaned the kitchen, she noticed the oven. The handle, once cold iron, had been replaced. A new one, carved from maple, sanded smooth. Warm to the touch, it fit her hand perfectly. She stood for a moment, fingers resting on it. Something inside her softened. That night, while the wind moaned outside and the children slept in warmth, Eliza stitched beneath the lamplight. She took the last scrap of their patchwork blanket, the one that had wrapped her baby the night they nearly froze, and sewed it into the collar of Sam's shirt. She folded it carefully and laid it on the table. Asterisk at dawn, Sam found it. He recognized the fabric, held it in both hands. He said nothing, but his shoulders remained still a long while. That evening, after the children had gone quiet and the fire glowed low, Eliza returned to the table. There, where her teacup usually sat, lay a single daisy. Wild, delicate, soft, asterisk. She stared at it. Years ago, his wife had braided daisies into her hair before the fever took her. Eliza reached out, fingers brushing its stem, and for the first time in too long, she forgot every place she'd ever called temporary. Asterisk. The snow deepened. The wind howled, and the world beyond their fence began to sicken. By mid-December, word came. Quietly riders passing, whispers carried through frost-bitten towns. Fever was coming. Chills, too many shallow graves. Asterisk. Sam had always kept his ranch sealed tight against the world, his fences stout, his doors shut, his trust sealed beneath years of quiet grief. But illness has a way of finding cracks no hammer or latch can guard. One pale morning, as Eliza was boiling water beside the hearth to scrub the children's clothes, a knock came sharp, precise like a nail driven into fresh wood. Sam stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing against the wind. There, seated atop a sleek black mare, was a man draped in wealth-like armor. His fine wool coat bore no snow, his leather gloves uncracked, the brim of his headset tilted back, revealing a grin to polished, to cold demean warmth. Roy Keller, Sam muttered, his tone flat as the plains in winter. Well, well, Roy said with a chuckle as he dismounted, his boots striking the frozen earth. Look what the season dragged in. Heard Callahan's place got a few new residents, 5 half-frozen kids, and a woman with city hands. That true? Sam said nothing, jaw working as he kept his stance still and solid. Roy's eyes swept the yard with casual malice over the stacked firewood, the vegetable beds now hidden beneath frost, the thin trail of smoke curling from the shed's chimney. I warned you last spring, he continued, voice slick as oil. This land's worth something, Sam. What are you holding out for, Mercy? You really think charity's a good crop to bet your future on? He leaned in, lowering his voice to a hiss. The flu's cutting deep, Sam, and if those little orphans of yours bring sickness out here, well, county might be persuaded to revisit your deed. Ain't as ironclad as you like to think, not if there's a public health concern. Sam didn't flinch, his eyes didn't shift. Leave, he said. Roy laughed, like a man who'd already signed the dotted line. Just letting you know, Callahan, the law listens to men like me. I've got ears in the courthouse and ink on parchment. He turned and mounted his horse without waiting for a reply. The barn door slammed in the wind behind him, but his words lingered in the air, sharp and bitter as iron and blood. Sam stood in silence long after the hoof beats faded, fists clenched tight enough to pale the knuckles. That night, the fever came. Eliza's second boy Caleb collapsed near the stove, his body burning hot and trembling. His skin turned the color of ash. His words were a string of nonsense, lips cracked and dry. Eliza crushed mint leaves with shaking hands, soaked rags in cool water, pressed them to his skin, whispered prayers that had lost their language. But he only grew worse. Sam paced like a caged thing. Outside, the snow beat against the windows, wind howling like ghosts rising from the past. Without a word, he grabbed his coat, slung a sack over his shoulder, and headed for the barn. Sam, Eliza cried, clutching her son close, you cannot go in this storm. He didn't turn, didn't slow. There's medicine in town. It's 20 miles. Her voice cracked. You'll freeze before you find the road. But he was already in the saddle, riding into a blizzard that tore sideways across the plains like a scream. The storm offered no quarter. The wind clawed at his face. The snow swallowed the path until all direction vanished. Sam leaned low, hands stiffening around the reins, every breath stolen by cold. Time became meaningless. His vision blurred. All that mattered was forward. By the time he reached town, the streets were half buried. Ice clung to windows and doors like a second skin. He pounded on Doc Allen's door until it opened. She's got 5 kids, Sam rasped, his voice like gravel. One of them's burning up. The doctor, still in his night clothes, squinted at him for only a moment before grabbing his satchel and filling it with vials, powders, cloth-wrapped remedies. Be careful, Callahan. This storm's no joke. That boy's lucky to have you. Sam didn't answer. He took the satchel, turned into the wind again, and vanished into the night. He didn't make it all the way back. At first light, Eliza heard hooves stagger to a stop. She burst from the door, skirts heavy with snow. Sam's horse stood at the gate. Lathered and trembling, Sam was slumped in the saddle, head bowed, hands frozen stiff around the medicine bag. Still clutched to his chest, she screamed for Ethan, and together they pulled him down, dragging him inside. His skin was blue with cold, but his grip hadn't loosened. Not even near death. They wrapped him in every blanket they owned, fed him sips of hot broth, bathed his hands with warm cloths until color slowly returned. For nearly a day, he drifted, in and out, his breath shallow, his skin waxen. But he held on, and when his eyes finally opened, Eliza was there, her hand wrapped around his, her voice low and fierce. "You fool," she whispered, "you could have died." Sam's gaze flicked toward the cot where Caleb now slept, cheeks flushed with life, fever broken. "We lost our home once, Sam," Eliza said, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I won't lose you too." Sam didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the hush that followed, he reached for her hand again, and this time, he didn't let go. The days that followed passed in slow, quiet measure, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Sam remained by the fire, his body aching from the cold he had battled. The hearth offered steady warmth, but it was Eliza's quiet presence that held the space together. She moved around him with gentle determination, preparing a broth of wild sage, barley, and marrowed bone just as her mother once had. She fed him by the spoonful, wiping the corners of his mouth with a damp cloth, never letting her exhaustion show. The children helped in quiet ways. Mary toddled over with cloths for his forehead. The boys chopped kindling, their small hands careful but proud. On the kitchen wall, someone had scrawled "thank you" in charcoal, the letters crooked and imperfect. When Sam sat up for the first time, his eyes lingered on them. He didn't say a word, but he smiled. One afternoon, pale sunlight poured in through a cracked window. Eliza sat beside him, mending a torn sleeve, her needle threading in time with the fire's crackle. "I thought you were the kind of man who builds walls," she murmured, eyes still on the fabric. "But you've been building doors for us." Sam's gaze found hers. His voice, though raw, was steady. "I didn't know how much I needed people," he said, "until you showed up at my gate." They let silence fill the rest, a silence heavy not with loneliness, but with understanding. By week's end, Sam could walk again. His legs were slow, but his back was straight, his will stronger than ever. One evening, he slipped on his coat, met Eliza's gaze with a quiet nod, and motioned for her to follow. She wrapped her shawl tight and walked beside him into the crisp, fading light. Behind the house, past the barn, the snow had begun to thin. A wide stretch of earth waited flat and edged by trees, the hills rising gentle behind it. Sam pointed. "Spring's coming," he said. "Thought I'd build you all a cabin, right there." Eliza froze. The wind tugged at her hair, but she didn't move to tame it. Her eyes searched his. "Not for promises, but for truth. You do that." He nodded once. "This land's been quiet too long." She looked toward the spot and saw it not just earth and timber, but a future, a porch, a garden, children's voices rising into the sky, laughter rolling across fields once known only for silence. She stepped in close and laid her head on his shoulder. He stood firm, unmoving, letting her lean. As long as she needed, they didn't speak. The stillness between them said everything. Somewhere in the branches overhead, a bird began to sing, the first sound of spring. The sound of hammers rang out the next morning. The first beams went up, not with the rhythm of carpenters, but with the irregular cadence of people rebuilding. Something bigger than shelter. Sam worked without a shirt, axe biting clean through pine. Eliza measured planks with frozen hands and a voice of certainty. Her eldest gripped a saw with new determination. The little ones passed nails, their laughter echoing off half-built walls. They were building more than a cabin, they were stitching. together the scattered pieces of something nearly lost. One evening, as the chimney took shape and the roof beams met, Eliza stepped back. She climbed onto a crate, pulled a knife from her apron, and etched for words into the beam above the door. "This is ours." The light caught in the fresh grooves, and for a long moment, Sam stopped working. He read it twice, then a third time, and, for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled, truly smiled, a deep, steady warmth that lit his whole face. But the West never let peace rest too long. 2 days later, Roy Keller returned. He rode in slow, boots clicking on the frozen dirt as he dismounted and eyed the half-built house. "Well now," he sneered, brushing snow from his shoulder, "ain't this cozy? You building homes for strays now, Callahan, don't cry when they leave like your wife did." The words struck like a slap. Eliza stiffened. The children froze. But Sam stepped forward calm, deliberate until he stood just feet from Roy. Not threatening, but close enough to let silence do the talking. "They're not strays," Sam said, his voice quiet as thunder. "They're the reason this land still breathes." Roy blinked. His smirk wavered. Eliza moved to Sam's side and slipped her hand into his. She said nothing, offered no apology, no explanation, only presence. Roy muttered something low, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The silence that followed was thick, not empty, but full of choice, full of roots sinking deep, and full of a home finally being made, one nail, one hand, one moment at a time. It held more than defiance, something deeper, like quiet resilience forged in fire. Eliza turned to Sam, her voice nearly lost in the still air. "You didn't have to say it." Sam's hand tightened gently round hers. "I did." Then, without another word, they returned to their work. By the week's end, the house stood not grand, but whole. The door creaked when opened, and the shutters caught sometimes. But every inch bore the print of hands that had known hunger, sorrow, and now hope. They never mentioned Keller again. They didn't need to. On the final evening of that week, Sam tied a little bell above the new porch just low enough for the children to reach. When the breeze swept through just right, it rang softly, not in warning, but welcome. The house was still unfinished, but then again, so were they. And like the nails driven deep into those pine beams, they weren't just holding the house together, they were holding on to each other. The lower floor had 2 rooms, just enough for sleeping, and working during the busy pulse of May and June. Spring had come in gently, like a breath held too long and finally exhaled. Snow melted into the thawing soil, feeding rows of green that stretched up like prayers. Lettuce leaves unfurled shyly, and pea vines curled themselves around sun-warmed trellises. What was once frozen earth now murmured life with each step, out behind the cabin. The garden burst into color. Radishes blushed crimson against the soil, as red as old wagon wheels. Mint pushed its way up near the porch, its fragrance curling into the air. Eliza stood at the clothesline, pinning shirts and dresses that swayed like old ghosts in the wind. Her hair was loose today, sun-touched and golden, catching light the way ripe wheat does just before harvest. Sam was nearby, kneeling by the steps, hammering a second bench into place. It was nothing special, just pine, nails, and care, but he smoothed every edge with patience, because it mattered now. Laughter rang through the grass, sharp, joyous, real. The children chased one another, their small feet rustling the tall blades, their joy loud enough to stir the hills. The youngest had named the scruffy Mutinder, because every night he curled beside the hearth and refused to leave. Now he ran after the children with wild delight, barking and grinning, his tail thumping like a drum. Inside, the cabin smelled of cornmeal and butter. Eliza stood by the stove, stirring a pot with one hand and flipping flatcakes on the fire stone with the other. Sam stepped inside, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Almost ready, 3 more minutes," she answered, peeking over her shoulder. "That's if the little ones don't sneak them off the plate again." He grinned and opened the oven door, pulling out a hot baking pan. "Then I'll stand guard with my life if I have to." They ate outside, on a table Sam had built and set beneath the blooming rose bushes near the garden. Cornbread still steaming, apple preserves glowing in jars, thin slices of dried beef, and wild honey from a neighbor's hive. The sun poured over the scene like syrup, gold and thick and full of warmth. Elijah offered a quiet prayer. Sam sat, still, head in one hand, the other resting on his knee. The children dug in quickly, their laughter mingling with the sounds of chewing and soft talk. Later that evening, as the sky deepened to dusk, Sam sat alone on the porch steps with a letter in hand. His brother's handwriting, rough and crooked, filled the paper. One sentence stilled him. "It's been a long time since I saw your handwriting without a tremble." He folded the letter slowly and stepped inside. The kitchen table had been cleared, but a sheet of paper, a pen, and an unfinished order form for spring seeds remained. He picked up the pen. His hand, once unsteady, shaken by years of silence and grief, did not waver. Eliza, standing by the sink with her hands drying, turned. She saw him sign. "Your hand's steady now," she said, her voice soft, warm. Sam looked up at her, a weight falling away, maybe because someone's been helping me carry it. She didn't answer, just smiled, the kind that says everything. That night, after the children had drifted into dreams, they sat together on the porch bench. Fireflies drifted like sparks over the garden, and the wind smelled of mint and earth. Sam leaned back, boots crossed, his arm resting behind her. Eliza tilted her head to his shoulder. The weight was right, easy. For a long time, they said nothing. They didn't need to. Behind them, the house stood strong. In front of them, the garden reached forward. Round them, laughter had embedded itself into the soil like seed. They didn't talk about what came before, nor worry about what might come next. What they'd built had not just risen from timber and toil, but from tea poured without asking, from lavender folded into drawers, from children who no longer laughed like strangers trying to survive, but like a family that already had, and now had space to live. As stars spilled across the sky, Sam turned to Eliza. "Tomorrow we plant beans," she nodded, already knowing, "and tomatoes. I saved some seeds." He smiled. "Then we'll need another shelf. I'll keep the kitchen warm," she replied, fingers slipping into his. They stayed like that, long after the fireflies disappeared, long after the sky turned black velvet, long after even the wind hushed in reverence for the quiet joy they'd built. Not from money, not from luck, but from one another. The next morning, the sun climbed over the hills and found the gate open. A new wooden sign hung from a post, gently swaying in the breeze. "The Callahan home," it read. Each letter carved by Sam's steady hand, darkened with ash and sealed with linseed oil. It wasn't grand, but it stood proud, earned, on the porch. Eliza sat stitching linen, her needle threading slow, careful loops. She embroidered the children's names in bright red, one on each dish towel. Her brow was smooth, her smile untroubled, the face of someone no longer counting the hours between misfortunes. Up on the roof, Sam hammered down a new shingle. Spring had been kind, but rain would come, and the roof would hold. He paused, wiping sweat from his temple, and watched the children. They ran wild through rows of mint and tomatoes, their laughter rising like birdsong. Tinder, the scruffy dog, bounded beside them, barking with joy, tail high. There was no hunger in their eyes anymore, only light. As Sam climbed down, a wagon rolled past on the distant road. Roy Keller rode by on horseback, hat low, face hard. But this time, he said nothing. No sneer, no words, just silence. He saw the painted porch rail, the garden in bloom, the woman at peace with needle in hand, children so full of life they almost glowed. There was too much here now, too much Keller could never break or buy. Sam didn't wave. He didn't have to. That afternoon, a neighbor from DeValley's Over rode up. She carried a basket of oat bread, still warm. Stepping off her horse, she set it beside Eliza. Then she turned to Sam. "You didn't just build a house, Callahan," she said, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You built something we all forgot, hope." Sam's jaw tightened. He nodded, the kind of nod that comes from a place without words. The neighbor tipped her hat and rode away. Behind her, the breeze stirred the sign again. That evening, Eliza stood barefoot on the porch steps, eyes on a sky painted orange and purple, a sky that understood the storm had passed. Sam stepped up behind her, arms slipping around her waist. She leaned into him the way you do when you're sure the structure won't give way. Inside, the hearth glowed low. Bread cooled on the table. The baby, smallest of them all, was already asleep, a thumb tucked into her mouth, a quilt up to her. Eliza turned to him, eyes full of firelight and fading sun. She placed a hand over his chest, where his heartbeat pressed strong and steady. "You saved us," she whispered. Sam looked at her. Really looked. His voice, when it came, was quiet, solid. "No," he said. "You made me remember what home feels like." And in the hush that followed, just the wind breathing through the trees and the soft creak of warm wood settling, it was clear. Home had never been just a roof or a deed. It was warmth shared. Food passed, nights endured, and mornings welcomed dashed together. It was her hand on his chest, the echo of laughter in fields they had made their own. It was knowing someone would always be there when the door opened once more. They hadn't just built a house, they had begun. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of winter, the balm of warmth, the steady rise of love shaped one quiet act at a time, know this is only the beginning. Out here on the rugged edge of the world, every mended fence, every outstretched hand, is a second chance. And sometimes the strongest homes rise not from stone or plan, but from people who choose to stay. If you crave more tales of love that endured the wind, of strangers who became family, of hearts healed over dusty roads, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Because out beyond every hill, there's another story waiting, another fire to light, another heart learning how to stay warm again.